Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons. Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me." When Naomi realised that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
So hopefully quickly, we're going to be going through the little Old Testament book of Ruth. So I'm really keen to give just a fast overview of the book, and then just tack on a couple of brief observations around some of our potential responses to the book. And this is relevant, I think, for this morning, because it's when you hear about accounts, real life accounts from people who are, again, just find it so dangerous to be a follower of Jesus in the world, that you can be forgiven for asking the question, where and how does God intervene in the world? Where and how does God actually act in the world, here and now? Some people will probably tell you that you can see God intervening in the world, and some Christians will say this via things like miracles, so miraculous answers to prayer. Other people may tell you that you can see evidence of God working in the here and now through things like material success, perhaps, or good health. And then understandably, some people, if they struggle to believe in God, will look at the world and they won't see God intervening and acting. They'll see an absence. So their natural question is really, well, does God, if he's there, does he actually care? Is he intervening? Or is he the absent watchmaker who put the whole thing together, wound it up, and then walked away and just left us to our own devices? Where and how does God act or intervene in the world? Good, legitimate questions. And I think this little book gives us some clues as to how to answer that, particularly when things are hard. So in our Old Testament, the book of Ruth is side by side with another book that some of you would have heard of called Judges. And I think it's useful and necessary to almost read them side by side. They both recount some of the history of God's chosen people at the time, that is the nation of Israel. But they're different. Judges is a difficult, often harrowing read. It has these repeated cycles of the nation of Israel, again, God's chosen people, being unfaithful to the God who has saved them, who's delivered them from slavery in Egypt and brought them into this promised land. They leave him, again, repeatedly over time for other gods. And not only that, but as a result, they mistreat each other. They just behave to each other atrociously. And God hands them over. God gives them what they want and hands them over to the surrounding peoples. He allows them to be conquered. And then they cry out to God when they really need him, and God graciously shows mercy to them out of his great loving devotion to his people and saves them by these people, these figures called judges, political and military leaders. And then the pattern just keeps on repeating itself. Gradually, I think, getting worse and worse by the end. It can make for some really tough reading. Because the judges in this book, they aren't good people. They're often flawed to different degrees. They're not moral examples for us to follow. But they're big personalities, big, often charismatic personalities, and there's lots of drama and lots of action in the book of Judges. So you can almost compare it to some of the big budget Marvel movies, albeit with a whole lot of amoral and immoral heroes and absolutely no happy ending. But again, it's pretty gripping, it's pretty exciting, it's got some big personalities. So if Judges is the Marvel movie with a big cast of larger-than-life personalities and lots of harrowing drama, then Ruth, by comparison, is like an understated, indie, character-driven movie with no special effects budget, but a really good script. Lots of great dialogue. And a really good story that leaves you feeling enriched afterwards. And again, the interesting thing is that Ruth is set at the same time as the book of Judges and the same place. But Ruth is like taking Judges and then zooming in. It's a highly focused, detailed story that focuses on a particular group of people over a relatively short period of time. And again, Judges, Ruth, side by side, they're present in a kind of deliberate contrast. So the book, Ruth itself, can be broken down into 4 parts, plus a little epilogue. And again, plenty of people, plenty of commentators have identified this. This is my own work, so to speak. So you could say the first part is really the crisis. And this is chapter 1 that Toddy kindly read out. So you have, just quickly, Naomi, who's an Israelite, and her husband and 2 sons. They leave their hometown of Bethlehem in their native Israel because of famine. They travel to a neighbouring place called Moab. Naomi's husband dies. Her 2 sons marry Moabite women. And then her sons also die, leaving Naomi and her 2 foreign daughters-in-law. Now, travelling to Moab in the first place and intermarrying with the Moabites, these acts were flying in the face of Israelite law and custom at the time, because the Moabites were historical enemies of the Israelites. So to some degree, Naomi is already on the back foot. She decides to return to her homeland, Bethlehem, because, as we read, there's food that God has provided. The famine has been broken. But she also works out along the way that her daughter-in-laws probably won't be welcome in Israel, again, because they're historical enemies. So she tries to dissuade them. But Ruth is determined to remain faithful, or, in the Hebrew, a term that we hear repeatedly through this little book, hesed. So Ruth is hesed. We'll come back to what that means. Ruth is hesed to Naomi, to the point of adopting the God and the people and the culture of Israel. So that's the crisis. They're in trouble. But the second part, there's this glimmer of hope. When Naomi and Ruth return to Bethlehem, to Israel, Ruth meets a relative of her deceased husband and father-in-law, the famous Boaz. Boaz is a good and faithful, again, hesed, man, who treats Ruth, who's a foreigner, really, really well, who treats Ruth according to the law that God has given to the Israelites. He ensures that she's safe, that she's protected, and that her and Naomi are well fed. So there's a glimmer of hope, but part 3. roughly in the 3rd chapter, there's this hurdle to the hope. Naomi constructs a scheme by which Ruth asked Boaz effectively to marry her and discharge his role as a kinsman redeemer, a kind of specific and technical term at the time, a kinsman redeemer. That is, a relative of a deceased male who bore no children, who marries the widow to ensure that she's protected and that the family name is perpetuated through children. Again, it may seem strange to our modern ears, but this was a big deal in the ancient Near East, at least at that time, to keep bloodlines going, to make sure that property and land all remains in the same family. Now, Boaz is keen to play that role of kinsman redeemer, but there's another male in the picture who's a closer relative to Ruth, so he gets first opportunity according to law and custom. What's going to happen? Will Boaz get the girl, or perhaps more accurately, will Ruth get her guy? So that leads to part 4, the resolution. Boaz does indeed get the opportunity to be a kinsman redeemer and marry Ruth. They have children. Naomi is ecstatic, as she has gone from losing people, of saying, I went full and I've returned empty, to being full again, to being blessed by God with new family, security, and grandchildren. And then there's this epilogue at the end. We see that Israel's greatest king, David, he stems from this very family in Bethlehem, which technically means that he had Moabite blood, i.e. God's chosen king, a man after his own heart, who led the nation of Israel probably to their apex when it comes to political and spiritual glory, wasn't wholly, if you like, Israelite. Now, this story, unlike those recounted in Judges, is an almost mundane affair. Its characters really aren't that spectacular. They're not leaders, they're not judges, they're not rich, they're not powerful. They're regular folk. And the setting is out of the way. A small town, not very cosmopolitan, think probably Bernie's, circa 1980, something like that. It's kind of out of the way. And finally, the story itself isn't very spiritual. It's not overtly spiritual. So think about it. There's not many, if any, prayers. There's no angels. There's no miracles. There's no 10 Commandments or sermons on the Mount. There's no kind of highfalutin teaching at all. All in all, there's not much overt evidence of the divine, of God being there. However, these unassuming, everyday characters of Ruth and Boaz, and even Naomi, and the unnamed townsfolk in the background, they all exhibit this very specific and particular virtue to different degrees. They've got this quality that makes them different, obviously different, to a lot of the people, a lot of the high flyers that we read about in the book of Judges. And that quality, as we've already mentioned, is hesed. Hesed. So Naomi first uses the term in chapter 1, verse 8, in relation to how her daughter-in-laws treated her. It's translated, as we heard read in the NIV, as great kindness. Great kindness. But this term, this Hebrew term, is just such a comprehensive, rich term, it's hard to kind of boil down to one or two words, English words. Importantly, it's a quality of God. It's one of God's essential qualities. And he shows it towards his people, his creation. And in turn, he asks that people should show it back, should mirror it back towards him. We should show God hesed as he has shown us hesed. And importantly, we should show each other this quality of hesed as well. So it's essentially a relational term. It's steeped in relationships. And it bundles up, as the commentator Daniel Block said it bundles up the qualities of love, mercy, grace, kindness, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, covenant faithfulness. In short, he writes, it's a quality that moves a person to act for the benefit of another without any concern or respect to the advantage it might bring to the one who expresses it. That is, it's not self-interested. It's selfless. It's not mercenary. It's not, I'm going to do a good to this person with the expectation or the hope that I'll get some good back. So despite the book of Judges showing that things are really bleak across the nation of Israel, so the religious and political leaders are generally not showing hesed towards God or each other, the zoom in that we see on Ruth gives us hope. It's not all bad and bleak. There are still pockets of people, ordinary folk, who are mirroring God's has said back to him and others. So again, we get to this question, where is God's has said through this story? So we see Ruth's has said, that's pretty obvious. We see Boaz's has said as well. But whilst maybe not so obvious, I'm going to argue that God is quietly working away in the background all through this little story. And he's doing it in at least two distinct ways. So check this out. Firstly, God is working through seemingly random circumstances. There's quite a few examples, even in the first chapter, about, God, say, for example, God providing food back at Bethlehem. But the big giveaway is the wording in the original Hebrew in chapter 2. So Ruth asks Naomi, her mother-in-law, for her mother-in-law's blessing to go and glean food. Now, gleaning food from the harvest, it's not the same thing back then as actual harvesting. So the Old Testament Israelite law had these God-given provisions for those in society who were underprivileged at the time, namely the alien, so foreigners, non-Jews, the widows, because again it was a patriarchal society, and the orphan. So those three groups were particularly vulnerable. And Ruth was in two of them. She's an alien and she's a widow. So to ensure that these vulnerable people groups had enough within Israelite society, the landowners were commanded not to be 100% efficient when harvesting their grain. If some was missed or dropped, then leave it. Don't go back and get it. Leave it for the disadvantaged to pick up and live off. Now, Ruth had obviously heard of this stipulation and was hoping that people in Bethlehem would actually follow it. Again, because people were not so consistently faithful in those times. People were breaking the law all the time, so there was no guarantee that Ruth would be met with this mercy. And in verse 3 of chapter 2, we read in the NIV version that after Ruth had asked her mother-in-law, Naomi, for her blessing to go and start gleaning, to try gleaning, Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter," that is Ruth. So she, Ruth, went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. Now check this out. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. As it turned out, Ruth ended up gleaning in a field that A, belonged to a guy who was still Hesed. So he was still faithful to this costly stipulation of Jewish law, even in a period of religious decline. This guy, out of all the guys, out of all the field owners, he was still Hesed. And then B, this same guy happened to be related to Ruth's deceased husband and father-in-law. He comes from the same clan of Elimelech, as it turns out. So that's an English translation. The literal Hebrew can be rendered like this. Her chance chanced upon a field belonging to Boaz. The original author, is making a point with this clunky language. It's like saying, by a remarkable stroke of luck. The author is trying to make us, the reader, stop in our tracks and say, well, wait a minute. How did this come about? They want us to see that this was no coincidence. This was the very hand of God. Now, this may seem strange to our modern ears, but it's in perfect accord with what we read in places like Proverbs. The lot, so the dice, for example, are cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. This seems to be saying, in reality, fundamental reality, there are no coincidences. There's no luck, really. God was behind Ruth's chancing upon working in the field of a good guy who she happened to be distantly related to. The author is making it clear that God was at work, even if it was impossible to detect by those very people involved. So how does God work and intervene in the world now? Through circumstances, through events. There is no luck. But nevertheless, God can use these things without overriding people's free will and choice. So then there's the second way that God was at work through people. You've got Boaz. He's such an inspiring character. You'll see there in chapter 2 that despite knowing that Ruth is a Moabitess, so a foreigner, he still shows gracious faith, again, hesed, to her. So he offers her physical protection as well as food in verse 9 of chapter 2, which again is quite startling for that time and culture. He says, you'll be protected. No guy's going to lay a hand on you. And then he offers her water, which doesn't seem a big deal until you look at the details. Again, in verse 9, he says, whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the vessels that the men have filled up, which sounds normal enough. apart from the fact that in Israelite culture at the time, it was foreigners who drew the water. It was foreigners who drew the water, foreigners like Ruth. And secondly, women drew it for the men. So Boaz reverses both of those traditions here for the sake of being hospitable to Ruth. But the most beautiful part is the blessing he gives her, twice there in verse 12 of chapter 2. May the Lord repay you for what you have done, and the startling beautiful imagery of love and protection. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So the picture here, this beautiful picture of God as a mother bird, protecting her otherwise defenseless young with her own wings. Now here's the thing. Boaz pronounces this over Ruth. May God give you this bounty and protection. But then he, Boaz, goes and gives her those very things. Bounty, so heaps and heaps of grain for her and Naomi, and protection. Stay here in my field exclusively, and I can guarantee that you'll be safe. So how is the author saying God works? God works through his people. I think you could say God works directly through his people. Boaz incarnated, he put flesh on, he embodied, if you like, God's love and protection to Ruth and Naomi here. God's love and protection is embodied for the widow and the alien, courtesy of Boaz. God works here and now to us through each other. That's the big takeaway, through each other. We embody God's love. So that's a very quick overview of Ruth. Let me leave you with this encouragement. Look, things can seem really bleak and worrying when you look at global or national events now. I know I've been discouraged over the past month or so by what's been going on. I think you'd be a fool not to be to some degree. And on top of that, our own lives and contexts can be full of challenges and issues. But nevertheless, Ruth reminds us that God is still Hesed. He's kind, he's still faithful, he's loving, and he's acting accordingly, both behind the scenes through randomly, seemingly chance events and circumstances, but also through the people that he's placed around us. We often only see this working in hindsight, I think. So we can't actually see God working through circumstances and events until the time has passed and we reflect on what's happened. But nevertheless, we can choose to actively trust in the moment that even though I can't make head or tail of it, God is still working through these circumstances and events. Again, there's no coincidence, there's no chance. So God is working. His good plans for us will come to fruition. That's the first encouragement. But with that, let me add another. Ruth reminds us there's a place for us. There's a place for you here in God's story. God has said reached Ruth. So again, a cultural outsider, not even an Israelite, an historical enemy to God's chosen people. God has said draws her into his story. He draws her closer and closer to him. God has said reached Naomi. As we read, Naomi who had suffered loss after loss to the point of feeling embittered towards both life and God. God, through his Hesed, takes her, draws her back into his life and light. So regardless of where you are on your spiritual and life journey, the encouragement here is that God's Hesed can reach you. Wherever you are not that far away from God. So why not reach out? Why not reach out to him? Reach out to him, because you know he's reaching out to you. And not only that, but we have this profound privilege and calling of being agents of God's working. So in a small town, in like a relative backwoods, these very ordinary people embodied God's Hesed to each other. They were agents of God's love and faithfulness. God used them, little do they know, to change the course of history. Through their Hesed to one another came about the royal line of King David and ultimately that of Jesus Christ. They would have had no idea how their day-to-day life choices of Hesed would ripple out and literally alter and change the very course of history and the larger world. They didn't know that. And to be frank with you, neither do we. It's not like we've got any more kind of knowledge as to just how far and how wide the consequences of our day-to-day actions will spread either. But in our world, it's almost like we can become diverted and bedazzled with the equivalent of judges, again, like the Marvel movies. Larger-than-life characters, charismatic and powerful leaders, lots of drama and intrigue. That seems to be where the real stuff is. But to some degree, that's not true. That's not how God works. That's often not how life works. Like people have already hinted at this morning, and I think this comes through in some of the clips that we watched as well. And it certainly comes through in pop culture and a lot of the popular TV and movies that are doing the rounds at the moment. Life right now seems to be largely powered or driven by things like fear and scrambling for power and then holding onto it at all costs. Life just seems to be, in our modern world, a fear-driven power grab, which operates from a scarcity mindset. There's not enough to go around, I've got to get mine. Ruth reminds us that that is not the real truth. Ruth reminds us, again, that we are called to offer hesed to the alien, the orphan, and the widow, even though it's risky, even though it's costly, even though we got no guarantee as to how it's going to work out in the short term, but we can trust and act that way because we believe in a God who has offered all of that to us first and foremost. And that's the stuff that really matters. It's those choices that give our lives purpose and meaning. Again, in the everyday, seemingly unspectacular opportunities that we have to offer and show each other hesed. And again, not just to each other, but the modern equivalents of the widow, the alien, and the orphan. So let me pray. Loving Father, I just thank you so much for, I thank you for this super encouraging little story here, side by side, with an often hard and despairing picture of the world. I thank you that even when life is difficult and really puzzling, and there can seem to be so much chaos and a lack of love and faithfulness, so much stuff that seems to be driven again by fear and wanting to grab and hold on to power and secure our place in the world. I thank you we have this really human reminder of people trusting in you, finding security in your love and your power and your faithfulness, and being so motivated by that they can make some potentially risky and costly choices in the day-to-day of life. And I pray, Father, that we will draw comfort and encouragement from this. I pray that, again, we'll be convinced that even when we can't see you working for our good, and when we can't make out how circumstances and events are all moving towards your good plans being fulfilled, help us have the conviction that that is still the case. And again, help us just have, out of love and gratitude to you, help us be able to mirror that and show that to the people who you've placed in our midst. Amen.